Welcome back to Plim Auditorium. Before we begin, we'll share a land acknowledgement. We'd like to begin today by recognizing and acknowledging that we are on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these native nations prior to their forced removal, and these lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the history of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution over the past 150 years. We're also obligated to reflect on and actively address these histories and the role that this university has played in shaping them. This acknowledgement and the centering of Native peoples is a start as we move forward for the next 150 years. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Joseph Altschuler. I'm an assistant professor here at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and the chair of the Lecture and Exhibition Committee. It's my pleasure to welcome you tonight to tonight's event, a lecture made possible by the Max Abramovitz Endowment. Our curated series this semester is entitled Advocates Advocate. Architectural training empowers us to do so much more than design buildings. In what ways might architectural advocates advocate with and for communities? How can architects, designers, and planners advance the public policy and vitality of the public realm? What does civically engaged design look like in 2023? And in what new ways might designers impact contemporary public spaces? To what extent can architectural thinking and practice expand our collective capacities for empathy and justice? This series invites varied voices to respond to these questions as we imagine and speculate on the role of design advocacy in their work and in the coming years. Tonight we welcome Mira Henry and Matthew O, founders of the Los Angeles-based architectural design studio Current Interests. Operating through astute cultural observations, material experiments, and tectonic speculations, Current Interests advocate for a built environment abounding with playfulness, intimacy, and sometimes even awkwardness. Established in 2017, Current Interest built work is grounded in a joy for material specificity, color relationships, assembly details, and an engagement in critical cultural thinking. Matthew and Mira are design faculty at Southern California Institute for Architecture and have visiting faculty appointments at Princeton University and Harvard Graduate School of Design. Matthew's academic work is deeply influenced by the history of conceptual art practice as he examines the spaces and tools of production and the lines of communication that connect the worlds of design and building. He holds a Bachelor in Studio Art and Art History from University of California, San Diego, and a Master of Architecture from Southern California Institute of Architecture. Mira's formal research and writing focus on architecture, race, and materiality. She is a registered architect and is the recipient of the 2019 Architectural League Prize, among many other accolades. Mira holds a degree in art history from the University of Chicago and a Master of Architecture from UCLA. I first encountered Current Interest work, perhaps before they were officially Current Interest by name, but via Mira's practice during her very powerful Architectural League Prize lecture in 2019. Mira spoke about the entanglements of race, gender, materiality, and building character, as well as what she called the specter of the human subject. In that lecture, Mira guided the audience along an exuberant visual tour through Los Angeles, narrating building characters all along the way. We meet buildings that are, in Mira's words, brooding, colluding, color-saturated, and vibrant. That building has curly hair, Mira points out, at one particular Los Angeles edifice. I was extremely smitten and inspired by the capacity of their practice to use architectural strategies to invite new forms of empathy. Matthew and Mira recently published a gorgeous new book entitled Gathering that documents the first 5 years of their practice. I strongly encourage you all to check out a copy from the Ricker Library. In the preface of the book, in their own words, Matthew and Mira enumerate their namesake current interests via a tantalizing listicle that includes such eclectic topics as social histories, material histories, personal memoirs, infrastructural parameters, color values, image construction, economic efficiency, tectonic care, environmental controls, art practice, craft techniques, embodied knowledge, and matters of race and gender. They continue to elaborate, saying that gathering has become a natural framework, one that comes from an ongoing process of ushering in, of bringing together, of overlaying and building up. With that in mind, please join me in warmly ushering in Mira Henry and Matthew O to Plym Auditorium.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you for having us. Is this okay? Yeah. Okay. Well, this is our first lecture that we're giving after having published our book, Gathering. And so we titled the lecture Gathering. And as that word is, I'm excited to show you some of the work that we've done that is represented in the book. And yeah, we've been practicing for the last 5+ years together and sort of weaving, our practice is very much about weaving our own kind of individual interests together and through conversation that we have together, conversations that we have looking at the city, at building work, at building client relationships, all kinds of things, at scaling. But gathering as a term has also been deeply operative, as Joseph sort of began to describe for us, operative in sort of describing the sensibility of the work we do and how we do it, like what we make and how and why, right? So gathering is a noun, the gender gathering. We gather, there's materials that gather in this space, there's stories of people that are gathering in this space. Gathering is also a verb, and that is a sort of embodied sort of action, and it's very much about the way that we practice. So you'll see a lot of hands and things like that because we do a lot of kind of physical work and physical testing in our office, and as a way of sort of prototyping and testing things that we are working on scaling out in the world. Yeah. These are images of the book on a tapestry of materials from our office. Some of them are things we've made, some of the things we've specified for projects, and kind of this is the kind of scene that we'll begin with.
And so we thought we would start what's kind of exists in the middle of the book, which is a rather large tableau that we created. This tableau is this unfold in the middle of the book that collects some of the research and documentations and studies that Mira and I have been doing over the past couple of years in the classes that we teach together. And so this tableau, which is this generated image, collects two stories of two different blocks in the same neighborhood in LA. Each one of those blocks collect together, let's say, archives of the histories of the people, the economies, and the way in which the demographics of this particular neighborhood have changed. On the left-hand side, we see what is the 3600 block of Crenshaw Boulevard, and then on the right-hand side, we have the 2000 block of West Jefferson Boulevard.
Is there a turn on light a little bit? Because a lot of the images we have are kind of dark, and so it might be, is that a thing? Is that possible? Like it's in the front a little bit?
Yeah, it's...
I think it's because it's...
Let's bring the movie down.
She knows.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can we do that, please? this work is, Let's turn the lights down.
And so, kind of one thing about this tableau is that it was a way for us to kind of reflect back on a lot of the information that we were gathering, a lot of the stories and the narratives, things that existed in the past and things that we're also seeing projecting into the future of these two blocks, and as a way of kind of describing a neighborhood in a way.
Yeah, so what you see is we would be able to go to our lecture just on the actual content. We're not going to do that today, but you can kind of dip into it if you get the book. But I would say that just in terms of the arrangement of the material and the sensibility of that, as much as this is a tableau collection of materials, also a sort of scene or sort of setting, right? So if you just go back one more quickly, So it's a table setting. This is also something that we've been doing with some of the classes we've been teaching. We've been thinking about what does it mean to think about context, but also think about it in, through the lens of a gathering, a party, something that where we could imagine the kind of pageantry of the everyday that takes place, and certainly in the context of where we live in LA, how people kind of build their environments. A lot of it does come through challenge, but also kind of beautiful, kind of festiveness. So, we laid out a tablecloth, we kind of brought flowers, we ate cake, thought about, and as we were studying and thinking about various buildings and the kind of building history and the social history that is kind of embedded in these things. And it's not a sort of catalog of these things, right? The kind of gathering is, as we would describe, a sort of unregulated or deregulated kind of togetherness of all of these materials. They share space together and create new adjacencies and new kind of relationships across time.
And we've included in this tableau, it's a combination of, let's say, things that we've written, so text that we've written. It's a collection of oral histories from the inhabitants and occupants and people of those blocks in this neighborhood, bits and pieces of materials of projects that we've worked on, as well as recreations of things that we've found in archival photographs, films, etc. Things that are kind of blended into either the tablecloth that you're seeing there, reflected in glass, and also kind of piled up onto tables.
And on the 200 block, or rather the Crenshaw discount store, this block, which is the Crenshaw block, there are kind of two main protagonists in this block. One is a building called Family Savings and Loans that was designed by Paul Williams, and another in the when did that building get?
1928.
The Family Savings and Loans was a little bit later.
1962, and then
later, exactly.
Crenshaw discount store.
But then the Crenshaw discount store, which was done by Victor Gruen, these are these kind of two buildings which Victor Gruen's building, which was his first kind of building in LA. But it was, these buildings are very rarely talked about at all, let alone together. And we've been thinking about sort of how to tell the story of a neighborhood by maybe starting to kind of uncover, understand the kind of archaeology of a block, let's say. Sorry for being on the hook there, I forgot.
So this tableau is something that kind of an integral part of the way that we work, the way that we think about the material world around us, how we kind of gather these stories, how we gather material, how we look at the past and the people and the objects that kind of get created in that past, but also how we in turn look back at the present. And so usually at the start of a project or at the start of a class that we might teach, we go out and we attempt to photograph and document the place that we're that we're studying. Usually these photographs take place at odd hours of the day, so usually at either like 5 a.m. in the morning or 8 p.m. at night. We're very interested in times of day in which, let's say, different people are getting up in the morning to go to work. People are kind of coming home. And so these are really important moments for us where there's a sort of quiet tenderness to the space and to the buildings as a way of kind of looking at it as a sort of portrait.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that Joseph mentioned this kind of idea of like, how do you see this idea of kind of, how do you begin to think about identity in the context of buildings? I don't know, I think that we're not going to be able to unpack that, and I think that we're kind of still asking that ourselves, but this idea of portraiture in buildings and kind of contexts have been a helpful term for us as we kind of look at a place in a certain way and try and represent it through photography and kind of sit with a place for a prolonged amount of time, right? You don't just kind of go and do set research real quick, but you kind of there documenting, seeing a place. And this is a particular building. This is that is kind of it has all of this kind of heavy ornament. At the same time, the kind of curtains on the interior kind of hold us from the exterior out, right? There's a sort of kind of about face that takes place, a sort of holding an edge. And that tension between kind of the grandeur or presence of certain buildings as well as the kind of privacy that a lot of buildings, particularly in LA, kind of carry, speaks, has its own aesthetic, which is quite beautiful, but also speaks to the kind of needing to have spaces of privacy that is kind of essential for communities. So, anyways, this is a particular building that we love and is featured in one of the kind of block stories that we've been looking at.
So we're going to pivot just a little bit to a different tableau. And so if the tableau that we just looked at that was published in our book was a way of looking back at the research that we were doing of the city, of the field work that we were doing in the city. This tableau, which was one that was made at the start of the pandemic, was a way of also just looking back at the start of our practice. So this was something that we did in 2020. It was made about 2 months into the pandemic lockdown, and when everything was shutting down, and we necessarily had to kind of recede into the into like the office or our own homes, we kind of tried to figure out a new space of working or space of kind of assembling the conversations that Mira and I would have in person in our office and the things that we would look at. And so we started to just scan and copy and photograph every single thing that we had in our studio, piece by piece, one by one, and made a recreation of our own office wall in order to kind of assemble these things into that space. And so some of the images that you're going to see from this tableau are really kind of part of that energy. This was, those of you who kind of have gone through that moment in time, this was at the time attempting to use a new tool called Mira to assemble our new sort of studio space that we found ourselves in. And it also collects, similar to the other tableau, newspaper articles, photographs, as well as our own work.
Yeah, and so this is a portion of the much larger tableau, and to be clear, it was for a publication. We were asked to sort of think about an idea of, I don't remember what the topic was. It was on to maybe technology.
Assembly.
Yeah. So we're going to kind of shift and talk about some of our material work, our built work, from maybe the kind of research space, the kind of space of seeing the world, to trying to think about how to make work from that. And those two are not one and the same always, right? And are not always. One doesn't always lead to the other. I don't think that we think about how we kind of the practice of seeing the built environment, thinking about it, doesn't always necessarily turn into a design. Right, design project. It's a bit softer of a relationship. The kind of moment of analysis to the moment of creation, that's a kind of a gray zone. But we will now kind of shift to some things that we've been making. So this is a project that we did where we were looking at small houses in the same neighborhood as the 2 Blocks project, and really looking at kind of front yard, this kind of zone, the zone of the 20 feet front yard setback, and the kind of narrow band in which a lot of material layers start to collect. So on these little houses, you see eaves and overhangs and shutters inside and shutters outside. You see bars on the outside, you see grills on the interior, foils and tints. There's curtains and blinds, and of course there's also the hedges. And there's a lot happening there, and the front yard is it's a contested space, right? It's a space often of regulation. It's also the space in which, you present yourself. You either fit in or you don't fit in at this very moment, right? In the kind of signaling of particularly of a home. These, that there is a kind of politics of the front yard, a politics of the front window. This neighborhood also is one, like many, is one of incredible change. It's a neighborhood that was built for one demographic and has shifted to another, and we're really looking at the ways in which we can kind of track that and see that, and kind of the role of the front window and the front yard as a space of identity expression. So we began to think about particularly the hedge as a kind of object of study, and looking at the hedge and the way things grow in LA, because things are insane. You give them a little bit of water and everything grows. Truly there's a house inside there. There's bushes that are taller than a house. Sometimes that very house comes to the shrubs itself. So we began to think about what it means to build our own hedge and build our own kind of pop-up book. This on the right is a picture of what we described as a kind of a pop-up book that was made of Tyvek and sewn with small pockets inside to be able to prop up and put almost like tent poles inside. So it would fold down and fold into a kind of a folio-sized book, and then be able to prop up, and kind of it leans and it sags and it has a sort of casual presence, but it nonetheless is its own kind of hedge. And it began as a kind of exercise of engaging the kind of the field, right? We borrowed plants from neighbors and scanned them and measured them and did all these kind of things. We were kind of really thinking about like the kind of specimen of the plants. Of course, the landscape itself tells a whole story around travel and movement of people, and so this hedge became a kind of a way for us to start to think about how landscape can hold that and hold that politics. And like many things, we like to photograph from one side of the street and photograph, stand on one side of the street and photograph across the street, and did the same thing with the hedge. So we took it outside, we propped it up as best we could, and took some pictures. And then, the hedge itself has an image construction, has had another life. As a life of a curtain. We did a gallery show, an exhibition. It was actually exhibition design a couple years ago, last year and a half ago actually, at the Mackey Apartments in LA, Schindler Apartments, and we were working on this kind of jacquard woven tapestry, and so translated that kind of woven hedge image into a textile, which one could fashion in different ways. It had pulleys and buttons and things. On the exterior, we think about the textile and these as very much as kind of forms of architecture, where there's ideas of an outside, there's ideas of an inside, and various kind of levels of structure. In this case, the exterior is a anti-paparazzi fabric, so it's silver and it's very kind of shiny and a little bit sleazy, and it kind of has these kind of details kind of running through it. Of course, it's anti-paparazzi material, which means that it's impossible to photograph, which we think is pretty interesting. And on the interior is the kind of hedge image with these kind of weights and pulleys to kind of gather. These are some of the images of the ways in which we think about fashioning the very curtain. Right? So we think about fashion maybe not so much in terms of clothes and style, but maybe more like a verb, like to fashion something is to, move it up and down. And then this is just a kind of a comparison of two different images. On the left is an image of the photo of the image of the material without a flash, and on the right is the one with a flash. And you can see the paparazzi materials kind of making it blow out. And I think the kind of very tone shift. And maybe that's when it goes back to like, what does it mean to kind of turn the lights down? I think shifting the tone is something that we're often thinking about when we're developing the idea about a material palette and what we're working with.
So we're going to shift over to, let's say, another part of the tableau that we were looking at earlier, into a project that we were calling Silver House Studio. So this carries over a number of the themes that we are seeing with the Hedge that Mira and I were starting to develop as a partnership and a conversation that we were having between ourselves about the sort of role of opacity, around the role of difficult imaging within a project. And so this project, it was proposed as a project that was kind of a studio for an artist in Los Angeles. The project didn't end up getting built, but from this one project we have a number of sort of key themes that have been persistent within our work in the next years kind of following this. And so what we're seeing here is a sort of artist studio in the front, and then in the back, which is the Silver House. This was the house of the artist that had commissioned us to do this work. And so just going to their site and some of our initial studies of it, on the right, you see an existing building that is in front of the Silver House, which was something that was kind of falling over a bit. It's an old unreinforced masonry unit that was built in the 1920s and was really kind of getting taken over by these vines that were kind of sort of filling up the top of the roof and becoming these sort of sideburns down around the sort of garage door. But then the thing that really struck us about the artist's house up on top of the hill is two things. One, they had painted their house a car primer silver color, and so it had this beautiful kind of glow to it. And then they did this sort of an odd thing that we were kind of seeing with some of our earlier interest with the Hedges and the sort of front ideas of privacy, is that they actually boarded up their front window, the street-facing window. They had boarded up. There was nothing wrong with the window. They just wanted more privacy, and they wanted to kind of recede back into their own interior world. And so, while the house has this sort of shininess to it, the sort of degree to which it is about a form of layered privacy was important to us. And it reminded us of some of these earlier studies that we're looking at. One, the houses in the neighborhood that we were documenting, as well as the Hedges, right? So this sort of act of getting the darkest window tinting on your front windows to kind of really shut out the sort of view inside. So looking at the design of the project, we proposed an addition onto the existing structure. We had to, out of necessity for zoning, we needed to keep the majority of the previous structure that was largely the sort of URM wall system, and thinking about a set of fiber cement corrugated shingles that pile on top of the roof to kind of replace the sort of vines and hedges that you're seeing right there. Just looking at some of the plans here, there's an idea of kind of keeping those existing walls, but building a set of layers towards the interior. So a set of structural frames that would hold up the walls from the inside, that would kind of hold things up, as well as thinking about a series of other layers, kind of removing the insulation that's usually tucked inside and hidden inside of wall and building that out as a blanket to the outside, as well as the shingles, the layered shingles that you're seeing on the exterior.
Yeah, and I'd say that this is kind of where our work suddenly became, and there's an optimism and there's a kind of naivete, I think, in the work, excitement. We were excited and we were working on this project. It was like our first building project that we were working on, and we were asked to, we were asked to also exhibit it in a gallery. We'll show you some of the kind of mock-ups we did for this. But where am I going?
Yep.
Yeah. But I wanted to say one thing about the excitement, because there was, hold on, one second, which is that there's an imaginary here, but there's also a kind of seriousness around, let's say, the building performance and environmental performance, actually, of like dealing with an existing condition. How do you add structure? How do you add insulation? How do you add all these things? How do you dampen the sound? How do you think about the physical environment? Is something that we kind of fell into by kind of in the way we started to work, and it kind of really shifted, I think, the way in which we were thinking about how materials aren't just kind of aesthetic layers, but actually clearly, but could actually move us into a conversation around kind of building performance, environmental performance. All of these things are kind of rubbing up against that. We think it's kind of helpful to see some of the models we worked on, which is that, we work a lot in physical models. To this day, we are making models in the office. We start rough, they become more and more refined. This becomes a space of work, it becomes a space of communication for us, right? So when we're thinking about a roof, it's not a sort of plane in Rhino or something. It's like, okay, let's think about it as a layered system that how does it stand up? How do we layer? What is it going to sit on? And in this case, we began thinking about it as a frame and upholstery foam. So we're really thinking about what does it mean, like the softness of something, and how do you kind of translate into a kind of a roof form. So there's a kind of modality here, and this modality coming from looking at the seriousness of tailoring and things that are, the way that textiles perform in all kinds of environments. In this case, the silver interior, and we developed a kind of interior blanket that was an insulation blanket, also kind of had a kind of visual kind of conversation with the silver lap siding beyond, and you can see that in the kind of photograph on the left, which is an interior shot of the model, where you can begin to understand the kind of conversation, a kind of call and response between the interior blanket and the lap siding beyond.
So the design of that project was really fast. All of this was kind of taking place over the course of a summer, and so from which meant that we were largely designing through that model that we were just showing, and so that we would say it was at the beginning of the summer in 2019, and then towards the end of the summer in that same year. We were asked to put together an exhibition at Princeton. And so, of course, we decided, we need to figure out how to build this thing at one-to-one. And so it's still an early stage in the sort of process of the project, but we thought that we could imagine a way of assembling all of the layers and the parts of the building as a sort of dry fit. Against the sort of frame, right? Then that sort of idea of the dry fit meant that it allowed us to think of each layer, each material component, and each sort of referent to that material on its own terms, separately, right? So we can kind of look at these shingles that we're seeing here. That were these fiber cement shingles that we hand dyed. Two colors, green that is nearly black and a red that is nearly black, as well as a sort of the sort of large silvery blanket that we had lining the interior. Some of the columns that we were working with, that we had designed into the project, the structure, we kind of show them here as made of two materials. There'd be two wrapping materials. One would be a dye bond that's blue, and with dye bond, getting the sort of color palettes that you have available are usually the palettes that are usually most used and produced, and so I believe this is like a Best Buy dye bond, Best Buy blue. And then the column covers were these soft foam custom cast urethane foam that we mixed in blue pigment into, and so it kind of becomes this Yves Klein blue layered on top of that. And so just kind of looking at some of the layers, everything was treated loose, right? So again, this is a dry fit of that material, so even the stucco itself that would normally go onto the brick surfaces was sprayed using an elastomeric stucco onto a sort of mesh that allowed it to be still soft, and the sort of columns, things that come from models, right? So decisions that you make on the fly around adding texture and smoothness in a model, in a scaled model. What does that mean to scale that up, and what does that look like? And then also just how do we think about the production of these things and making, again, going back to the JPL slide that we were looking at earlier about the sort of covers and the seamsters and seamstresses that are kind of building these covers for the Mars rover at JPL. We are also kind of making these things in our own studio, thinking about how we assemble and sew them together. And they become window openings, as well as some other odd sort of features like this large rubber gasket window frame made of like two different short hardnesses of rubber that allowed it to have this long tongue that can stick out. And we would write about these things. We would write about the sort of way in which window tinting and window films get regulated as a way of kind of reflecting back on the materials that we have, or the material layers that we have in our own project, right? And so everything that we're doing, at least with the way that we're thinking about the layers of materials and the surfaces, is how they always relate back politically, socially, materially, culturally. And one last thing on this one is just that Mira was talking about with the anti-paparazzi fabric that was around the curtain, as well as the issue with the silver house behind the existing structure. We were very interested in the way that things things get imaged, or things are difficult to image. And so we were very interested in the sort of low light that kind of held a space in front on one side of the installation, and then the sort of bright light that's kind of shown against the silver painted walls in the background.
And then the gallery is also a space, its own background, right? Its own background. We would have conversations in the gallery space, which were really an important leap for us to think about expanding audience and participating in discourse. This is a conversation we had with artist James Welling and architect Mario Gooden, and we were talking about ideas about color and juxtaposition, and really trying to kind of overlay a set of discourses, some of which are deeply aesthetic, others very, aesthetic, political, historical, and also related to technique. So this was a real highlight for us, being able to bring two people who really respect so much to talk about their own work in the context of the space that we held for that time. Another exhibition, and this is a show that preceded much of this work, and it's called Rough Code, and it was a show that I did in 2018 at SIRE, and so right when Matt and I were beginning to kind of develop our own conversations, and there was, this was kind of at the beginning of our support of one another. And so Rough Code is, the idea was to develop a facade scale blanket. It was a bizarre idea. I'd been looking at these little houses and thinking about privacy, thinking about the hardness of an exterior and the intimacy of an interior, and wanted to try and see what would happen if those go together. I was studying stucco, particularly elastomeric stucco, flexible stucco, and was working on upholstery techniques sewing, quilting, pleating, tufting, things like this. So it was, this is the house that kind of became a sort of my muse. It's now been remodeled, like most houses in LA. Yeah, this project was, I didn't know where the project was going. I knew what I wanted to make, and wasn't sure exactly what it was going to say. But ultimately, I think that the project became really valuable, one in terms of part of its failure, which was that the work, when we first put it into the gallery, the gallery space had these very, very bright lights, and I brought the work in, and it was really obsessing over the exact color brown and all the ways in which the body of the upholstery was reading, and you put it in there and the lights were super bright, and it looked really bad. I was like, oh my God, I left. And then, we were working with how to turn the lights down and how to add gels and how to build out the space, paint the walls, and kind of create a kind of mood for the work. And it really mattered. And I think that it's kind of literal, but also a metaphor for kind of how you want to speak is also kind of how do you set the tone for that speech. And also how to represent this work. So this work was also not photographed by an architectural photographer, but a portrait photographer. So we brought in a friend of ours who, and we invited people who had relationships with one another, not just our friends, but people who brought families in, and we kind of hung out and we had kind of photo sessions of this work, and and people did things with it. We were thinking about this, what would it mean, almost like the intimacy of a hoodie, if somebody could kind of refashion a facade in that way, which itself, again, is a sort of imaginary, but it kind of opened up a way of thinking about the kind of intimacy of architectural material. And the work had a lot of kind of really interesting kind of color effects. Depending on one way you look, it would look really brown and purple, and other points of view it was very green. And so there was a sort of kind of learning that happened. There was a love for what was being made, but also learning about the kind of interaction of space and color and representation that was happening here. And this is a really beautiful kind of image on the left that the photographer took of one of the people, Hakeem, who was there, kind of turning his back. And it really holds a space for us, because I think that we think a lot about the ways in which a sort of about face takes place in a lot of kind of buildings around us. People turn around, and there's a kind of turn look and figure, which is the kind of turning of one's back. And there's a sort of privacy and intimacy there, and then buildings can do that too. This leads us to another project. We have just a couple more projects we're going to go through rather quickly, just for the sake of time. We'd love to have a conversation with you guys. But these are 3 projects that we're in construction right now. This is a small, we'll call additional dwelling unit, or ADU. It's a very simple volume, like a lot of the projects we work on. We're not working with a lot of complex geometry, but rather kind of a really deep layered sort of set of kind of cladding. And kind of much like the ornamented building, the curly building from the last image, this project we were trying to figure out how to develop something that could recede into its environment, and at the same time hold a certain scale.
So we've been referring to this house as a terracotta house, and it's first kind of starting with a series of images that we'll have that we made, either renderings or models, to kind of begin to understand what we were working towards as we were building the house in real time. So what we're seeing here is 2 rows of lapped terracotta tiles. They are not attached, they're not grouted to the wall, but instead they're hanging on a series of metal shelves that allow them to lap in the way that you're seeing. And so there are, let's say, 2 different widths, and the patterning and the sort of sectioning of the groups kind of give it its presence. We tend to, when we're working, or at least lately, when we've been working on models, to understand the things that we're making, we work on a pretty large scale. So we make models at 1:8. And so what that allows us to do is at that size, let's say 1/8 of an inch is 1 inch. And so really we're kind of working on, sorry, 1 second. we're working at a scale that kind of allows us to begin to understand what some of the material processes are in making the building that we're working on, and also how that might relate to the sort of economies of construction that we're doing. Right? And so the tiles for this house were manufactured in a factory in Ohio. And on one hand, they kind of come out of an extruder as these large clay terracotta tiles and kind of set aside. And then there is a person that comes in and hand cuts them in half. And so the sort of the texturing that you're seeing in the model is something that is produced by hand, and so there is a sort of element to these things that is not as sort of rigid and machine constructed as maybe like the initial renderings that we were producing of the piece would show. And we really love this sort of element of it, the sort of presence of the hand and the presence of the people that are actually making the work. And we, of course, like the previous projects, like to draw that as we're working and thinking about it, and drawing the procedures of that. And some of the interiors that you're seeing, sort of toned walnut interior clad. This is just some images of the models and some drawings that we produced of it, but you can kind of get a sense of even the concrete ground we began to kind of grind and cast in these models.
So this project went to construction about a year ago, and it was, when we talked about terracotta house, it was very much in dialogue with the terracotta roof tile, which we see a lot in this neighborhood. And terracotta tile roofs are super interesting because they start off as a kind of two-layer system, but then over time, when leaking happens, they like add another set of tiles. And so a lot of the houses in this neighborhood have like 3 or 4, even sometimes 5 layers of the terracotta tiles on top. And that kind of excess and kind of relationship with the terracotta that has its own history in Southern California, relating to its relationship to Mexico, is, and Mesoamerica, is something that we're really interested in. So the terracotta for us was also a sort of nod to its context. In this case, we we painted a kind of an engobe, which is kind of a slip that goes onto the terracotta, kind of a deep green. It kind of is different, but nonetheless related. And this is a picture of us installing. You can see the kind of metal frame, and in a lot of ways we're learning from the one-to-one mock-ups we made for Princeton, for the Silver House. We're learning and kind of bringing some of those kind of rough, loose fit qualities into this project. These are some pictures of the project is still in construction. The site's still kind of a work zone, but these are nonetheless some photos of it right now. And you can see the kind of qualities of the terracotta and their kind of imperfection, which is quite nice too. It's very handmade kind of looking. This is the building now, and our Southern California view of the project.
And then these are, we're going to show just a couple of images of a project that is very fresh right now. So we are working on another house that is going to have a series of cast terracotta tiles that will be produced in Guadalajara, I think in like a month or so. It's pretty fast. And so again, in the multiple ways that we work in our office, we'll build things at 1-to-1 scale, which you're seeing on the left, as well as a sort of 1-to-8 scale to begin to understand the relationships of these models and these parts and pieces. And so in designing this facade, or this wrapper to the building that we're working on, we were very interested in these sort of histories of block terracotta construction, and also in terms of the way in which those have been used in other or inspired by other artists. And so we're fascinated first by, we were fascinated by typewriter drawings by Annie Albers that she produced after visiting some of the sites in Mitla and Oaxaca, as well as kind of thinking about the sort of inversion of some of that path for this house. And so we also, in designing our own block tile facades, began to design it through kind of typewriter-esque drawings in it, and so through some brackets and X's and I's and other letters that we would build up to understand the texture and the sort of patchwork that we're seeing on the facade, right? And the way that, let's say, this material imagined as a sort of dark clay body terracotta could begin to kind of recede at moments within its own environment.
And so the last, we'll kind of leave you here with this last couple of images of us making some of our own concrete tiles. We've been studying concrete, aggregate concrete for the last 2 years, first as a landscape project, and then as something that we've actually been flipping up from the horizontal to the vertical for a project for our house that's in construction right now. And these are some images of the aggregate concrete, which is kind of beautiful, idea of a kind of integral system that is with a kind of mix of different stone, which on the left is exposed and on the right is brown, so you get kind of two different color tones happening. And on the right is a 340-page book of aggregate. Do you want to talk about it now?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically we're kind of obsessed with the sort of mixture of these of this poured concrete, and so we made a book that would be a version of that. So every single page is like a slice section through that concrete block, and so that's what you can see.
Yeah. So this is a kind of a novel object that we also work on, so this was the kind of beginning of a landscape project we did earlier in the beginning of COVID, and then we can kind of flip to us looking at a house that we're working on right now, which is where we're kind of flip these into the vertical and developing them as a kind of stacked fiber concrete system that can get clipped to the side. So this is the model, quite large model. It's still sitting in our office, and the very tiles that were being cast in that little bit. And we're going to end here. Thank you guys very much.
Great, thank you.
And we've heard that this is an inquisitive audience. That's what we've heard. So.
We'd love to hear from you. We've got some questions.
Sit down, yeah. Sure. Sit down. Sure.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you for coming and sharing with us your lovely work. I just want to clarify if I'm possibly correctly. You mentioned some of the tiles are being made in Guadalajara.
Yes.
Okay. And the project's located in Los Angeles.
Yes.
Yes.
Why would there be investment of that amount of resources to bring tile from Guadalajara to Los Angeles?
It has to do with a relationship. The town that we're working with, or the tile makers that we're working with are specialized in making tile, and so we wanted to be able to kind of work through their knowledge and their expertise and their sort of skills and crafts and that sort of tradition that they've been kind of carrying for quite some time.
quick